Hey guys, I hope you're doing well, and I hope that you had a good Easter weekend, enjoyed a little bit of extra time off. We're going to pick up in our literature on page 580, talking about W.H. Auden. So if you'll look in your books on page 580, let's talk about him. He was born in England in 1907, but he did come to live in America in 1939 and became an actual citizen of America in 1946. And when he moved to the United States in 1939, that was there was a major shift in his thinking. Prior to that, he had kind of believed he was predominantly Marxist in his thinking and went along with those major ideals. But then when he moved to America, we had this shift in his thought, and he then was realizing all of the social problems that come from that. And so he started to write and satirize social problems and express his belief in that the British middle class was going to be collapsing. And then after 1939, he switched from Marxist ideas to predominantly religious ideas, not necessarily biblical ideas, but he did start to suggest in his later poetry that the solution to social problems might lie in religion, although he doesn't specifically say the religion of the Bible. He is looked at as a traditional poet because of his poetic style and his technique. He uses the traditional things such as alliteration, assonance, internal rhyme, those type of techniques. But like a lot of the other poets, even though they might use traditional forms and techniques, they still use modern content, modern problems, and you see the modern attitudes. So he used conventional literary forms, but he used those to analyze modern problems and attitudes. The poem that we're going to look at from him is called The Unknown Citizen, and you will see as we read it, it's very satirical. He is satirizing the modern welfare state. When man is controlled by the state and the government tells him everything to do and controls every aspect of his life, what does that look like? You'll see that this poem, the satire, he uses burlesque. And if you remember what that term means, that's like an exaggerated imitation of something. So this is what in these welfare societies, what the bureaucratic people would probably say about this person here, this unknown citizen. So supposedly there's this monument that is being dedicated to this unknown citizen. So let's look at this poem. He was found by the Bureau of Statistics to be one against whom there was no official complaint. And all the reports on his conduct agree that in the modern sense of an old-fashioned word, he was a saint. For in everything he did, he served the greater community. Except for the war, till the day he retired, he worked in a factory and never got fired, but satisfied his employers, Fudge Motors Incorporated. Yet he wasn't a scab or odd in his views, for his union reports that he paid his dues. Our report on his union shows it was sound, and our social psychology workers found that he was popular and with his mates and liked to drink. The press are convinced he bought a paper every day and that his reactions to advertisements were normal in every way. Policies taken out in his name prove that he was fully insured, and his health card shows he was once in the hospital but left it cured. Both producers' research and high-grade living declare he was fully sensible to the advantages of the installment plan and had everything necessary to the modern man: a phonograph, a radio, a car, and a Frigidaire. Our researchers into public opinion are content that he held the proper opinions for the time of year. When there was peace, he was for peace. When there was war, he went. He was married and added 5 children to the population, which our eugenist says was the right number for a parent of his generation. And our teachers report that he never interfered with their education. Was he free? Was he happy? That question is absurd. Had anything been wrong, we should certainly have heard. All right, so you see how he's like, oh, this guy, he was perfect. He did everything the government wanted him to do. But the final couplet, was he free? Was he happy? In reality, this is Auden's question. It is designed to make you, the reader, see that everything is wrong. The citizen is not free or happy. He's merely just existing Rather than enjoying life, he's like an automaton, a conformist, a pliant tool of the state. And those last two lines reveal the satire, the satiric intent of that poem. Okay, let's move on to Ezra Pound. He was definitely a very interesting character here. He was one of the experimentalists. There was this group that came about during this time called the Imagists. It didn't live very long. It came about around 1909, became popular around 1914 until about 1917, and then it kind of died off. But their idea, the Imagists, what they wanted to do in Imagism was like the spirit of revolt against established poetic conventions. The poets wanted to do what they wanted to do. Its major goal was to create a very sharp image of something in very, very few words. So let's talk about Ezra Pound. He was probably one of the most influential of these Imagists and of the experimental poets among the modern poets. He left the United States in 1908 and joined the group of expatriates in London, and he soon became kind of the leader of that expatriate group. Remember, expatriates are people who left America because they felt it was stifling their creative abilities, and so they lived in London or Paris. And so he joined the group in London and kind of became their leader and kind of the moving force behind this influential Imagist movement. Excuse me. This Imagist movement was influenced by a few things. Oriental poetry, especially haiku. Remember, haiku is that very, very short poetry saying, making an image with very few words. They always encourage using the exact word, exact words, saying as much as possible in the fewest words possible. And you'll see that as we look at these poems, they're extremely short. And probably their major theme or idea, if they were to have a message, is that poetry should not have a message. Okay. Well, Ezra Pound, as I mentioned, he went to London, joined the expatriates there. Then, after 1920, he moved to Paris. He lived in Paris for about 4 years. Then after that, he went to Italy. Now, this is where he kind of got into trouble. When he was living in Italy, he became an outspoken supporter for fascism and anti-Semitism. And even though he's still a United States citizen, remember, but he started to make anti-American propaganda broadcasts during World War II. So as a result, he was charged with treason, which explains the picture there in the lower corner that looks like a prison mugshot, because it is. So he was charged with treason, came back to the United States after World War II, but the charges were dropped because, get this, he was declared insane by a board of medical examiners. Now, whether or not he truly was, I don't know. But he was then sent to a federal hospital in Washington, D.C., and he was there in that hospital for 12 years. And before efforts were successful in getting him freed, there were lawyers, several congressmen, Archibald MacLeish, who was another poet that we're going to look at, all made efforts to get his release, finally did. And when he did get released in 1958, he went back to Italy, and he lived there until he died in 1972. So we're going to look at this poem of his, In a Station of the Metro, probably his most famous of the Imagist poems. And you'll see this poem is an implied metaphor. See if you can figure out what the metaphor is, okay? The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. All right, so did you figure it out? What is the metaphor here? You know what the metro is. That is the subway in Paris. Okay. So it's this, he creates this image in just those few words of someone being on the metro, looking out their window and seeing all these faces just in a blur as they go past riding the metro, and they look like petals on a wet tree branch, right, is what he compares these to. So creates this very stark a specific image in just very, very few words. All right. The next one we'll look at is William Carlos Williams. He was not just a writer, he was also a doctor, a pediatrician. And so whenever he could spare time at night or in between appointments, he would write. And he studied medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. And he did spend some time in Europe, but he didn't stay there, like the expatriates and settle there. He returned back to New Jersey and spent the rest of his life there. He really looked up to Walt Whitman, was strongly influenced by him. He was our first a major American poet who was experimental. So he really looked up to him. And he believed that meaning could be found only in actual specific objects. That was where meaning could be found. Meaning could not be found in ideas or things that were not tangible, is what he believed. So we have two poems that we're going to look at by him, both of them very short. The first one is called Poem, and this one captures an action. You'll see it's about a cat, and we're capturing a cat in action. The second one, The Red Wheelbarrow, is going to focus on an object. But just keep in mind that he thought that meaning could only be found in actual objects. So let's look at his poem entitled Poem, about the action of a cat. As the cat climbed over the top of the jam closet, first the right forefoot carefully, then the hind stepped down into the pit of the empty flower pot. So not real deep, but we get this image of a cat, right? All right, then The Red Wheelbarrow. This one I am going to ask you to do something for me. I'm going to ask everyone to comment on this poem on Google Classroom. I want you to leave a comment about what you think about this poem, The Red Wheelbarrow. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. This whole poem focusing on an object. What do you think this poem means? And so I want you to comment on Google Classroom, even if you say, I really have no idea. Okay, so I want to see what your comments are. Then after I see your comments, then I'll put on my 2 cents worth, all right, and tell you what I think. This poem is very, very famous, well-known poem. And so I want to see what you think, and then I will give my comment after that, okay? All right, let's look at Archibald MacLeish. Okay, Archibald MacLeish. I put that quote on there because I thought it was interesting. A man who lives not by what he loves, but what he hates is a sick man. Interesting quote. All right, so unlike many of his fellow poets, he had a lot of important public positions within his lifetime. He went to Yale and then he went to Harvard. He practiced law in Boston for a while. He then moved his family to Paris so that he could devote his time to writing. But notice the positions that he held. He was a lawyer. He was a writer. He became Librarian of Congress. He became an Assistant Secretary of State, and then also became a Harvard professor. So a lot of things, those kind of happened after his move to Paris. But he moved to Paris and then joined the group of expatriates that were there, became good friends with Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ezra Pound. But he only stayed there for 5 years. So after 5 years in Paris, he deliberately rejected that life of an expatriate, decided to come back to the United States. And then this is where he started kind of that second phase or second of his career, where he started to write poetry that showed an awareness for national, social, cultural heritage. And then in the final phase of his career, that's when he started to call attention to the nation's pressing social issues and held those positions like the Librarian of Congress and Assistant Secretary of State and Harvard professor and all that. He also won several major literary prizes and became a professor at Harvard. So notice that his poetic contributions, they're not measured only by his connection with imagism, okay? So just remember that about him. He did other things as well, a lot of other things. And we're going to look at his poem, probably his most famous poem is called Ars Poetica, which in Latin means the art of poetry. So he's kind of defining and expressing the Imagist theory of poetry, even though when this was published, the Imagist movement had kind of died out, was waning. but we have a series of very sharp images that make up a definition of the art of poetry. And this poem has been called a fitting epitaph for the Imagist movement. You know what an epitaph is, right? That's something that you put on your gravestone, after someone has died. So the Imagist movement was pretty much dead and finished, and this has been called kind of the epitaph, or what you would write on the tombstone if the Imagist movement had one, okay? So notice all the similes that are in this poem. I want you to be able to point those out. And then those 2 lines that I put on the screen, those are important lines that you should be able to remember. So let's look at his poem, Ars Poetica. A poem should be palpable and mute as a globed fruit. So do you see the first metaphor? What is he comparing a poem to? He's comparing it to fruit, right? Palpable and mute means it should be able to be touched, but it should be mute or silent. So a poem should be silent. It shouldn't be saying anything. Second, dumb as old medallions to the thumb. Dumb, again, means silent, not speaking. The second simile here is what? He's comparing a poem to coins. Okay, coins don't speak. They're silent. Silent as the sleeve-worn stone of casement ledges where the moss has grown. A poem should be wordless as the flight of birds. A poem should be motionless in time as the moon climbs, leaving as the moon releases, twig by twig, the night-entangled trees, leaving as the moon behind the winter leaves, memory by memory, the mind. A poem should be motionless in time as the moon climbs. Notice he repeats that couplet, right? So it must be important. A poem should be equal to not true. For all the history of grief, an empty doorway and a maple leaf, for love, the leaning grasses and 2 lights upon the sea, a poem should not mean, but be. And that would be the thesis or the theme, is that last line there. A poem should not mean, but be. In other words, he is proposing art exists simply for art's sake. It doesn't have to mean anything. It doesn't have to be saying anything. Art is art if you say it's art. Art exists just for art's sake. Okay? But what is ironic about this poem? What is the irony? Do you see it? Do you hear it? The irony is that he is saying that a poem should not mean anything, but while he's saying that, his poem is meaning something. Okay? So kind of ironic, right? He's saying a poem should be equal to not true. A poem doesn't have to be true. It doesn't have to mean something. It shouldn't mean something. It should just be. It just needs to exist for the sake of art existing. All right, and that's where we will end today, right there. And then we will pick up with Carl Sandburg on Thursday. So be prepared tomorrow. Have your exercises done so that you can have those graded. And then we will be having our grammar test tomorrow as well. Don't forget to leave me a comment about what you think about the red wheelbarrow. And we will talk to you later.